I'm going to be giving you guys some tricks for every sword in Blox Fruits. And I'm also going to be telling you about some secret swords that you might have not known existed in the game. And starting off, we have the Katana. The Katana is sold for 1,000 on the Pirate Starter Island. And it can be bought from the sword dealer. And this sword is really basic. It doesn't do a lot of damage. It's not that good for combos. And it has two abilities, Quiet Rush and Air Slash. And they do exactly what they sound like. A good thing about this sword is that it's really decent for starters. And you definitely want to buy this if you want to advance in the game. But keep in mind, it's only good at the start and you want to change to a different sword as soon as possible. And next up is a CUTLASS, and this is another sword that beginners use, similar to the Katana. You buy it from the exact same place and it also costs 1,000 berry. The sword is basically the same as the Katana. It's good for starters, but you want to get rid of it as soon as possible. Now this is a sword called the Dual Katana, but 2 times 0 equals 0. You can buy this sword for 12,000 at the Pirate Village in the first sea. And this sword is also a pretty good sword for beginners, but only beginners, keep that in mind. It's good for grinding in the Pirate Village, but once you reach the Snow Island, you definitely want to switch to a different sword. This is the first uncommon sword that you can get your hands on. It's called the Iron Mace. This can also be bought in the Pirate Village, and it costs 25,000 belly. The Z move has really decent knockback, making it pretty easy to area farm when you start off. But all of the Mace's abilities are close range, so if you're trying to hit people from far away, it's probably not going to be that effective. Now we have the Shark Sword. It has a 10% chance of dropping after you defeat the Saw boss, which spawns for 15 minutes at Middletown, but it only spawns every 1 hour, so keep that in mind when you try to farm this. Overall, this sword is decent, but it's not something you want to waste your time getting, because if you grind enough in the first sea, there's other swords that are way more worth your time. And now we have the Triple Katana, and you're going to want to buy this sword as soon as you reach the Frozen Village. It costs 60,000. It's going to help you with leveling up tremendously. It is pretty cheap, good for beginners, decently quick, and the mastery requirements are really low. But both abilities from the sword are short range, so it's not that ideal for PvP, unless the player is standing right in front of you. And next up on the list, we just have Pipe. It can also be bought from the sword dealer of the East, but this one costs 100,000 belly. And one of its abilities, called Earth Smash, it makes it really decent for grinding because it does a ton of area damage. But a bad thing about that is that you cannot use Earth Smash if you're midair. And overall, the sword's abilities are really close range, so if you're fighting someone far away, you're gonna have a hard time. Next up on the list, we got a first rare sword. It's the Warden sword, and the way you get it is by killing the Chief Warden, and he has a 5 to 10% chance of dropping it. And this sword also looks really cool because of how big it is. Good things about this sword is that it has a really low mastery requirement for its abilities, and the moves are really fast. And all moves also have an area of effect, making it really decent for grinding. But both of its skills also do have knockback, so it's going to send your enemies flying uncontrollably. And keep in mind that the damage is also pretty low, so it's not that ideal, and you probably just want to stick to a different sword on this list. Okay, so now we have the dual-headed blade, and this sword is a rare sword and can be bought from the Master Swords dealer, which is located at Sky Islands in the first sea, and it costs 400,000 belly. Some good things about this sword is that it deals a decent amount of damage for how much it's worth, and its moves don't have a delay between the third attack, which is pretty good. It makes it pretty decent for grinding. And this sword is something I recommend you guys use when you farm with an elemental fruit. But one bad thing about it is all its abilities don't have a single stun move. That means you're probably not going to use this much in combos. But overall, it's still a pretty decent sword for how much it's worth. So next up is the Soul Cane, and this is a pretty sick sword that you can buy from a hidden place at the Magma Island. It costs a total of 750,000 belly, and it also looks like a cane, obviously. Some good things about this sword is that it has really good combo potential, and the Soul Beam stuns for a really long time. It's good for farming because both abilities of the sword have an area of damage effect, which means they attack more than one enemy. But one bad thing about it is that it has really short range, meaning that you can't hit targets that are really far away. Okay, so now we have the Bicenito. This is a legendary sword. A pretty cool thing about this sword is it can use one of the Quake Fruits abilities. And the way you get it is you buy it from the Master Sword dealer located on Skylands for 1 million belly. But keep in mind, you need to be at least level 250 to buy it. A good thing about this sword is that its Z ability has decent range and you can fight people close to medium range. And this is also pretty good for grinding because it hits multiple targets at once and it has high damage. But a bad thing about it is that the abilities take forever forever to recharge, so it's gonna be ages before you can use them again. But the good amount of damage that it does makes up for it. Okay, so moving on, we have the Trident. The Trident is a rare sword that you can get by killing Fishman Lord in the underwater city on the first seed, but the Trident only has a 10% chance of dropping, making it pretty difficult to get. A really cool thing about this sword is that one of its abilities literally lets you become Spider-Man, similar to the string fruit. You can just grapple onto a place and you can swing there in a matter of seconds. You can also use this to fight against enemies, but it's really hard to aim, so it's probably not the best choice. And other than this one, the sword doesn't really have any long range attacks, making it pretty hard to use. One of its abilities, called Water Pulse, deals damage to every single enemy surrounding its area, but this is literally only in a space of like 1 meter. It's not going to be that useful unless you have a bunch of people grouped up on you. For the next sword, actually this is more like a pole. The way you get it is by defeating the Thunder God that's in Upper Sky Islands in the first sea, and the pole only has a 5% chance of dropping, so it's pretty difficult to get. The thing about this sword is that it has some pretty mediocre stuns, but it also has decent damage to make up for that. And something else is that all rubber users are completely immune to the sword's damage because the sword is completely lightning based, and rubber fruit users take no damage from any lightning based attacks. The explosive cloud ability from this sword is also really easy to dodge. I mean, you could literally use like 2 dashes to escape it. And the mouse one attacks from the sword are also really slow, so this sword overall is not that good of a choice. Okay, so now we have a legendary sword called Saber. The Saber sword is one of the best swords in the game for PvP, and the reason for this is that you can upgrade it to its V2 version, which makes it extremely overpowered. And the way that you get this sword is by completing the jungle quest, which requires you to press all of these different buttons and talk to a bunch of people to complete the quest. And once you've done that, you have to fight the Saber expert, which is underneath the Blox fruit gacha, and once you defeat him, you have a 100% chance of getting the sword. And the way to upgrade it to its V2 form is you need to have a 1 million bounty or honor, and you have to kill another player with the sword, which has the same level of bounty as you. And like I mentioned before, this is the best sword in the game for PvP, which means the damage it dishes out is huge. And it's also pretty decent for grinding, but there are better swords. And both the abilities of the swords are pretty hard to dodge, especially if you're standing really close to the person. A bad thing about this sword is that none of the moves of this sword break observation, which means it's not going to be that useful for combos. You have to get a different observation breaking ability first. Now we have the SADDI sword, and this sword is a legendary sword that can be bought from the legendary sword dealer, who spawns in for 15 minutes in random locations throughout the second sea. But keep in mind that he only spawns in every 4 to 5 hours, so it's going to be pretty hard to find him. And the sword itself costs 2 million bellies, so that kind of money is going to be pretty hard to get your hands on. And this sword is overall a really good sword. It has good damage, hitboxes, combos, and decent for farming. But a bad thing about it is it has pretty mediocre range. And one of its abilities, called Sword Dance, is pretty hard to aim for someone, and you can't change direction once you've started moving, making it pretty hard to use. Now we have the Wando sword, and this sword is also a legendary sword that can be bought from the legendary sword dealer. And this sword is also pretty similar to the one before, and it costs 2 million belly. But this sword specializes way more in PvP than the other one. It has really high damage, and one of its abilities stuns the user, repeatedly slashing them a huge amount of times. And its scatter shot ability is really good for combos. But keep in mind that this is still a second sea sword, so compared to the third sea swords, it's basically terrible. Now we have the SHISUI sword, which in my opinion is one of the best swords in the second sea, and this is also a sword that can be bought for 2 million belly from the legendary sword dealer. And the SHISUI sword has really good range, insane combo potential. But a bad thing about this is it also does not break observation, so if you want to do a combo with the sword, you need a different ability to do it for you. But overall, this sword is really overpowered, and the abilities from it look really cool. So now we have the true triple katana, and basically what this sword is a combination of all 3 swords from before. And to get this, you need all of them, and then you need a 300 mastery on all of the swords mentioned before. Once you've done that, travel to the green zone and go to the highest stem that you can find. Then you'll see a guy called the Mysterious Man, and then you can purchase that sword for 2 million belly. But keep in mind, since you need 3 other swords, they basically cost 8 million belly. And this sword has a lot of pros. The mouse one speed is above average, and this is a really good sword for raids. And all of its abilities are really good for combos and dishing out high amounts of damage. And this sword is also one of the best in the game for grinding. And this sword has the highest damage per click out of every sword in the whole game. The bad thing about this sword is that one of its abilities, Wolffang, is pretty easy to evade. And its Dragon Hurricane ability is probably not the best for grinding, but it doesn't matter too much since the sword's passive ability is really overpowered. Okay, now we have the longsword, and the longsword is a rare sword that you can get after killing the diamond boss, but it only has a 10% chance of dropping. The sword has pretty high combo potential, but not that great compared to some other swords on this list. And it's decent for farming because its passive ability is an area of effect move. A pretty bad thing about this sword is that it has really low damage compared to other rare swords in the game, and it's probably not worth the amount of time it takes to get it, since you need to kill the diamond boss at least 10 times for it to drop. Okay, so now we have the gravity cane, and this is a rare sword that can be obtained with a 5 to 10% chance after defeating Vegeta, who's the boss of the green zone in the second sea. All of its attacks are gravity based, and it has really good damage, decent knockback, and it has really low mastery requirements, but it's pretty hard to obtain since you need to kill this boss like a lot of times to get it. And its X move with the meteors is really hard to aim, and if you actually want to hit a player with this, you need a lot of skill. But the sword is more focused on PvP, and if you want to grind, it's not that optimal. Okay, so now we have JITTE, and it can be obtained with a 10% chance after defeating the Smoke Admiral, who's at the hot and cold area in the second sea. And trust me when I say this, the only thing that this sword is good for is mobility. The damage that this sword pours out is really bad compared to other swords its level. Okay, finally we have another legendary sword. I'm talking about Coco, and this sword is really crazy for PvP. And something really special about this sword is that it can be buffed if you use the control fruit. And the way you get this is by killing Order, and it has a mere 10% chance of dropping, but in my opinion, this is definitely worth it. One of its abilities breaks the observation ability, which makes it really good, and also has decent damage. A bad thing about this sword is that it has really high mastery requirements, which means you have to do a lot of grinding before you can use the full potential of this sword. And now we have the Midnight Blade, and in my opinion, this sword is definitely the best looking sword so far. I mean, just look at it. It looks amazing. And the way you obtain this sword is buying it from L Admin, who's located on the cursed ship in the second sea. And it only costs 100 ectoplasm. So by the time you're done with your quests on the ship, it should be pretty easy to get. And one of its abilities literally opens a portal, which makes it even cooler. This sword has decent combo potential and does a decent amount of damage for the price it costs. And you probably only want to be using this sword at close range because its long range potential isn't really that good. And it also has really high mastery requirements, so you're gonna have to do a bit of grinding. Now we have the Rengoku sword, and this sword is one of the longest swords in the game. I mean, literally, look how big it is. And the way you get it is after defeating the boss at the ice castle, you have a chance of getting a hidden key. And once you get that, you can open up a secret room. And then once you click on the chest, it should give you the sword. This sword has really good knockback, making it a really good sword for PvP. And its burning slash ability also breaks observation. And its abilities also have good travel distance. One bad thing is that to obtain it, the hidden key from the boss is pretty hard to get. So you're gonna have to kill the boss a bunch of times to get it. Now we have the second form of the pole sword from before, and it can be purchased for 5,000 fragments from the Thunder God after completing a Rumble raid. Keep in mind you have to have the fully awakened Rumble fruit with the 250 mastery on it to get this, and the pole sword needs to have 180 mastery requirement. It's going to take a lot of work to get this. This sword has high stun and damage potential, and something special about this is that it can hit rubber users unlike other lightning based attacks in the game. Bad thing about this, to get this sword, since you need to fully awaken the Rumble fruit, that costs 19,500 fragments, so it's really expensive. Even though this sword is really good, in my opinion, it's not worth the amount of time and money it takes to buy it. Okay, so now we have the Dragon Trident, and this Trident definitely looks better than the one from before. And the way you get this is by defeating the Tidekeeper, and he has a 5 to 10% chance of dropping it. And since he's the hardest boss in the second sea, he's going to be pretty difficult to kill. And the passive ability from this sword is why it's pretty decent. It deals a huge amount of damage. And one of its abilities, Sea Dragon Fury, is really easy to hit your targets with. And the Water Dragon Prison stuns your enemies. And the hitbox for this sword is really huge compared to the other swords. Bad thing about this is that it has really high mastery requirements. And its Sea Dragon Fury attacks only breaks observation if you aim it perfectly. But overall, other swords on this list are definitely more worth it since the mastery requirements for this one are really high. Now we have the Yama sword, and the way you get this sword is you must have at least a total of 20 Elite Hunter or Player Hunter quests that have to be finished. And once you've done that, you have to go into the secret temple located on Hydra Island, and behind the waterfall is where Yama is located. All you do is you simply pick it up by clicking on the sword 4 times. Good thing about this sword is that both its abilities have really good mobility, and the X ability has a good stun, making this sword overall really decent for combos. One bad thing about it though is it's really difficult to get since you need to do a bunch of quests to get it. Now we have the Tushita sword, and this sword is really similar to the Yama sword. I mean, they almost look identical. This sword has really fast attacks with high damage, making it one of the best swords in the game for PvP and raids. But the quest process to get this sword is really long, and I don't think it's worth it. But nevertheless, the sword has really good damage, good movement, good combo potential, and pretty easy to hit the attacks even without a stun. And now we have a pretty funny sword. It's called the Dark Dagger, and the Dark Dagger is a legendary sword, and you can get it from defeating Rip Indra, the level 5000 raid boss, but it only has a 2.5% chance of dropping. Despite how this sword looks, it's actually a pretty decent sword. It has really good combo potential, it has a low click cooldown, and the sword is almost impossible to Kentrick, making it really good for combos. But obviously the biggest downside is that, bro, it has the 2.5% chance of being dropped from the literal hardest boss in the game, so good luck getting this one. So the next sword on this list is the Canvader, and this is a legendary sword that has a 5% chance of dropping after defeating a beautiful pirate. And the way you get there is through a pair of doors located on the floating turtle island. Good things about this sword is that it's really good in PvP, and it's really easy to aim with, and you can use other moves when you're using its piercing dash ability. But keep in mind that they do not break observation, they just drain it faster. And this sword is only good for PvP, which makes it a pretty bad sword for grinding. So if you want to reach max level, this is definitely not the sword to be going for. Now we have an uncommon sword, and the sword is called Twin Hooks, and the way you get this sword is by defeating Captain Elephant, who's located at the floating turtle on the 3rd sea. Good things about this sword is that it has pretty decent damage and a large hitbox, and its attacking speed is really fast, but its skills have really low range, and none of its abilities break observation, and one of its abilities is really difficult to land. So overall, this sword is probably not something you want to go for, unless you're a farmer, of course. And now we have another mythical sword. It's called the Halo Scythe, and this sword is literally on par with fighting styles like Superhuman and Godhuman. Despite its mythical status, it's a pretty decent sword that has good combo potential and damage. However, when you pair with the Butterfruit, it becomes really good for grinding because of its low click cooldown. The best thing about this sword is that its mouse ones are really fast, and the cooldown is almost nothing, and its abilities have no casting times, which makes them really useful. So one of its abilities, called Death Cyclone, knocks the enemy back really far, so this ability is basically useless when it comes to grinding. It's better to just utilize your mouse one. And it also has really high mastery requirements. And did I mention the drop chance is literally just 1 to 5%? And one of the requirements for this sword is Halo Essence, and even that is considered a legendary item from the random surprises. So overall, this sword is really difficult to get, but if you do get it, then you're pretty lucky. Now we have a legendary sword called the Buddy Sword, and this sword literally has a face on it. The way you get this sword is by defeating the Cake Queen, and it has a 5% chance of spawning. And the place that the Cake Queen is located is Ice Cream Land in the 3rd sea. This sword has really fast clicks for its melee attacks, the moves are all really fast, making them hard to dodge, and the Lightning Wave ability has really long range. A bad thing about it though is that the Heat Slash ability is only single target, so if there's a group of enemies in front of you, it only hits one of them. And the sword is definitely not recommended for farming. There are definitely way better options out there. And even for PvP, it's kinda mid, making other swords on this list a lot better. Okay, so now we have another trident. This one's called the Spiky Trident, and this sword is known for its huge combo potential and overall damage. And the way you get this sword is by defeating the Cake Prince or the Dough King, but I recommend the Cake Prince because he's much easier to kill. But you only have a 5% obtainment chance from the Cake Prince. Meanwhile, the Dough King gives you a 15% chance. Both its moves are really good for traveling, which makes them pretty fun to use. And it also has decent damage, but this sword definitely specializes in boss grinding because it's much better for a 1v1 situation. And both moves are single targets, which makes it pretty bad for grouped up NPC grinding. And also has a pretty slow M1 speed. And none of its abilities break observation, so you probably don't want to use this for combos as much. Now we have another mythical on this list, the Cursed Dual Katana. And this, in my opinion, is probably one of the best swords in the game when it comes to PvP. And the way you get it is that you must have a 350 mastery in both Yama and Tushita. And then you have to complete the Cursed Dual Katana puzzle. And keep in mind, to begin the puzzle, you need to be at least level 2200. So the requirements for this already are really drastic. And to use both of the abilities of the sword, you need a 375 mastery. But if you do end up getting this, it's definitely worth it. The abilities do a really high amount of damage, their effects look really cool, and they're pretty decent for combos. But a bad thing about this sword is that both moves go in a straight line and they do not break observation. And since this sword has a lot of effects, your ping is gonna spike really really high if you don't have a good computer or internet. Finally, we have the Dark Blade, but keep in mind that this is not the best sword in the game. Just wait till you see what's next. The Dark Blade is the only sword in the game that you can actually buy for Robux. I mean, you can buy it as soon as you spawn in, and that's exactly what I did. It cost 1,200 Robux, and it's really good for beginners if you want to level up. And keep in mind, if you're kind of rich on Robux, you can also gift it to your friends. And the way to get it is by getting the Brazil cube that can be summoned by Rip Indra, and then you defeat Mihawk. And once you defeat him, there's a really small % chance that you get it. Good thing about this sword is that its X ability has a really long range, and the Z move can break instinct. I mean, it's literally called 1,000 slashes. It just locks you and repeatedly hits you, and you can't do anything about it, making this sword have really good combo potential. But it's really hard to auto-click with the sword since its third ability literally makes you dash forward. But a pretty decent thing about that is that third ability does way more damage. And now, last of all, we have the triple Dark Blade, and this sword just looks crazy, and it's the most overpowered sword in the game. But too bad, the only way you can get this sword is if you're an admin or at least really good friends with one. And the sword is exactly how it sounds. It's literally 3 Dark Blades. And you remember the X ability from the Dark Blade? Well, this sword literally does that same ability, but 3 times more powerful. Literally, it sends out 3 big slashes. And same with the 1,000 slices. If you hold the button, it dashes forward, cutting your NPC a several amount of times. And not much else is known about the sword because it's really hard to get your hands on.